Okay, Com 709, this is Ben Fraser. I'm glad to be here with you today. Wanted to just introduce the reading for this week and spend a little time encouraging you. I think many of you are doing very well on the discussion board. I lurk around in there and look at them. We do go through carefully and evaluate the weekly discussion. There's a few of you that are not responding fully and properly, and I have either emailed you or talked to you on the phone this week. But most of you are doing fine, and so that's very good. This week, of course, we're dealing with one of my heroes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, pastor, pacifist, and Christian scholar. In fact, he was a student of Karl Barth, if you know, the great theologian, and finished his first dissertation at the age of 21. And Barth said it was miraculous, and it was a very, very interesting dissertation. He finished his second dissertation at 26, so he has 2 PhDs apparently, and a very smart, intelligent man. Taught here in the States at Union Seminary, New York, as well as he taught in Germany, and eventually, as you know, went back to Germany and became part of the resistance movement against Hitler. Died at 39, was executed, hung by the Nazis just before the end of the war. If you're interested in learning more about Bonhoeffer, whose life really matches the power of this man's intellect, and unfortunately he didn't live long enough to write as much as he could have, and he lived a very busy life, but there's this really interesting documentary on his life called Bonhoeffer, pastor, pacifist, and Nazi resistor. Okay, and you can find parts of that, some of the interviews from that documentary on YouTube, and so I'd encourage you to go and look at some of those on YouTube. It's a very good documentary, one of my favorites. Also, if you want to read, there's currently Eric Metaxas has written a life history of Bonhoeffer that's very popular and done very well. Metaxas is a fine writer, and so I also encourage you to read that. Now, probably his most notable work is called Cost of Discipleship. Bonhoeffer has written, and of course in there he talks about the single-minded obedience to Christ, sort of like paralleled Kierkegaard's purity of heart is to will one thing, the fact that we need to be single-minded in our obedience and in our life to Jesus Christ. And in there too, there's that famous phrase about cheap grace and costly grace, and how cheap grace is Christ without the cross, is Christ's teaching without sacrifice, and cheap grace is that which is not worthy of the Christian's time. Costly grace, of course, is the cross of Christ, is taking on the suffering and with Christ, and how costly grace is how we're costly grace, he says, cost God his son, cost Jesus his son his life. And how can something so costly not be appreciated and loved? And of course, in there he talks about picking up our cross and following Christ in obedience to him that way. And that book is really put him on the map. It's a very good and very powerful book, Cost of Discipleship. I've chosen, however, a shorter book, Life Together. And I've chosen it primarily because of the first 30 pages. And the rest of the book is worth reading. It's very much German in its discipline and that sort of thing. But the first 30 pages really talks about what Christian love is and what human love is, and it shows the tension between the two. And the way I like to sum it up in some of the thoughts there, and there's so much in those first 30 pages, but there's 2 or 3 points that I want you to understand and look and look at, and most of them are around page 25, 24, 25, 26, right in there, where he talks about, as I said, Christian love and human love, and how Christ is not only the mediator between man and God, or God actually more correctly, and man, that Christ stands there. He is how God can accept us. But Christ also is the mediator between man and man. And he shows in there how Christian love allows us to love somebody else with a love that isn't demanding, that isn't desirous, that isn't requiring anything, because it is a love that is mediated by Christ. We go to Christ and we owe everything to him. And if I could just quote you a couple of his lines in there. One is at first on love. He says, human love is directed to the other person for his own sake. Spiritual love loves him for Christ's sake. He goes on to say that spiritual love comes from Jesus Christ. It serves him alone. It knows that it has no immediate access to the other person. And so what he's saying here, Bonhoeffer is saying here, is that when we communicate with somebody else, we always should, as people of faith and of Christ, communicate through Christ. Human love, he says, constructs its own image of the other person, and how true that is, at least at times in my life, of what he is and what he should become. It takes the life of the other person into its own hands. Spiritual love recognizes the true image of the other person. Of course, here he's reflecting on Corinthians 13 towards the end of that chapter, that he talks about, if we know in part, but we shall know even as we are fully known. Who fully knows us? Who fully knows anyone? Jesus Christ, God himself. The other person which he has received from Jesus Christ. So spiritual love recognizes the true image of the other person, which he has received through Jesus Christ. Not constructed himself, not tried to make up himself, not interpret himself, but he has gained through Jesus Christ, because we are made in God's image. And then finally, if I could just do, I think, two more phrases. He says first that, he says this, I will not seek to move others by all too personal and direct influence, by impure inferences into his life. I will not take pleasure in pious human fervor or excitement. I will rather meet the other person with the clear word of God and be ready to leave him alone with this word for a long time, willing to release him again in order that Christ may deal with him. You know, I think far too often we think that our opinion or our ideas are going to persuade or influence someone else. But more often we need to take the model of Christ very clearly and very seriously, when he would not necessarily run after the rich young ruler, when he wouldn't cheapen the gospel, but that he would speak with it and let then the words of the gospel and Christ himself work in that person's life. Thus, he says, this spiritual love will speak to Christ about a brother more than the brother about Christ. And that's on page 26 and 27. The quote before that was on page 26. That is the heart of what I really wanted you to get out of this book. It has a profound influence on a model of communication that a Christian or a person with Christian concerns would have. I think that can influence, and those words from Kierkegaard, even though I found Cost of Discipleship a deeper book and in a longer book, and a lot to approve it. I found that in these first 30 pages, just very powerful for my own model of communication theory. And I hope if you take the time, that it instructs and helps you. God bless you. Have a good day. Talk to you soon.